Imagine standing in the heart of an ancient Aztec temple, the air thick with incense as priests chant in a language lost to time. Above you, the stars align in patterns only they understand, and in that moment, you sense something terrifying, an echo of a ritual so powerful, so forbidden, that its very existence was erased from history. The Aztecs didn't just worship time, they believed they could bend it. Their calendars weren't just tools to mark the days, they were blueprints for manipulating the fabric of reality itself. And hidden within their sacred texts lay secrets so dangerous, they were guarded by blood oaths and whispered only in shadows. What if I told you the Aztecs discovered a way to loop time itself, and that their most terrifying rituals were designed to trap moments in an endless cycle? This was a civilization obsessed with cycles, the turning of the stars, the rise and fall of empires, even the rhythm of life and death. To the Aztecs, time wasn't a straight line, it was a spiral, a wheel that could be spun backward or halted altogether. Their priests studied the heavens not just to predict the future, but to rewrite it. They built temples aligned with celestial events so precise, they could pinpoint the exact moment when the veil between worlds grew thin. And in those moments, they performed ceremonies so potent, they risked unraveling the very order of the cosmos. But among these rituals, there were some considered too perilous to record, rites that promised control over time itself at a cost too horrifying to name. What drove them to such extremes? Picture a world where every drought, every flood, every defeat in battle was seen as a disruption in the cosmic balance. The Aztecs believed their survival depended on maintaining this balance, and if that meant bending time to their will, they would dare it. But the rituals came with warnings, whispers of priests who vanished mid-ceremony, of warriors trapped in repeating nightmares, of entire cities vanishing from history as if they'd never existed. Today, we're peeling back the layers of these forbidden practices, uncovering the truth behind the Aztecs' most dangerous obsession. How close did they come to mastering time? And what happened to those who tried? The answers lie buried in ruins, encoded in glyphs, and woven into myths that still haunt us. This isn't just history, it's a warning from the past waiting to be understood. The Aztecs saw time not as a river flowing in one direction, but as a great wheel turning endlessly through cycles of creation and destruction. At the core of their belief was the legend of the 5 suns, 5 eras, each ruled by a different god and ending in catastrophe. The first was devoured by jaguars, the second swept away by hurricanes, the third consumed by fire, and the fourth drowned in floods. Each collapse wasn't an end, but a transformation, proof that time itself could be reset. We live now under the 5th sun, they believed, destined one day to be shattered by earthquakes. But here's where their philosophy turns chilling. If time was cyclical, then its patterns could be predicted, even manipulated. The Aztec calendar wasn't just a record of days, it was a map of recurring cosmic moments when the gods might be swayed. Priests tracked these cycles with terrifying precision, observing celestial events down to the hour. A solar eclipse wasn't just an omen, it was a crack in time's fabric, a fleeting chance to intervene. During these moments, they performed rituals so precise, they believed they could anchor a moment, forcing history to repeat it. Imagine a ceremony where every step, the angle of a sacrificed blade, the count of incense grains burned, was calculated to mirror an event from the past. By recreating it perfectly, they thought they could bind time into a loop, drawing power from its repetition. But why risk meddling with forces even their gods feared? Because to the Aztecs, stagnation was worse than annihilation. If the universe stopped cycling, existence would unravel. Their most secret rites weren't about control, they were desperate acts of preservation. A king might repeat a victorious battle's ritual to ensure future triumphs. A drought could be broken by echoing the rain dances of a golden age, yet whispers persist of rituals gone wrong. Codices hint at the twisted ones, priests who performed a loop imperfectly and found themselves trapped between suns, neither alive nor dead. Their fate was a warning. Time could be bent but never truly broken. Behind every twisted time loop ritual stood the Tonalpohualli, the Aztec priests who spent lifetimes studying the secret rhythms of the cosmos. These weren't just holy men, they were mathematicians, astronomers, and in a sense, the first physicists of the Americas. Their training began in the Comicac, schools so rigorous that students bled from self-inflicted wounds to prove their discipline. They memorized the movements of planets down to the minute, learned to decipher the Tonalpohualli, the sacred 260-day calendar believed to map the universe's pulse. But their most dangerous knowledge came from forbidden manuscripts, codices painted with human blood, detailing how to pull the thread of time during celestial alignments. To manipulate time, these priests had to become living mirrors of the gods. Before a ritual, they'd fast for days, ingest hallucinogens like ololuqui, and pierce their tongues with stingray spines. Pain was the price of clarity. Dressed in jade-studded robes symbolizing eternity, they'd stand at the center of temples designed as celestial timepieces. The Pyramid of Templo Maya, for example, wasn't just a place of worship, it was a machine. Its staircases counted the days between solstices, and its altars aligned with Venus's brightest appearances. When the stars clicked into position, the priests would chant syllables so potent, tradition claimed they could make the sun hesitate. But their power came at a cost. Being an intermediary between gods and mortals meant bearing the weight of paradox. Some codices describe priests aging decades in a single night after a failed ritual, or speaking in reversed sentences as if time itself had tangled their tongues. The most chilling accounts tell of Nahuel's shape-shifting spirits who'd impersonate priests mid-ceremony, corrupting the ritual's symmetry. To prevent this, assistants stood guard with obsidian blades, ready to strike if the priest's reflection ever stopped matching his movements. Why take such risks? Because in the Aztec worldview, priests weren't just servants of the gods, they were mechanics of destiny. When famine struck or enemies advanced, it meant the wheel of time had jammed. Only they could grease the gears by recreating pivotal moments from myth. A single misstep, though, and the wheel might spin backward, or worse, shatter entirely. That's why the highest-ranking priests were buried with their lips sewn shut. Even in death, they guarded time's secrets. At the center of Aztec cosmology pulsed the Tonalpohualli, a sacred calendar of 260 days that didn't just measure time, it contained it. Unlike the solar calendar tracking seasons, this was a spiritual clockwork, a mesh of 20-day signs and 13 numbers cycling in perfect sync. Each day wasn't merely a date, it was a living entity with its own energy, a divine fingerprint shaping destiny. Warriors were born under the sign Oxlotl, the jaguar, for stealth and ferocity, while those born on Quetzalcoatl, the lizard, were fated to be healers. But the priests saw deeper patterns. Certain days thrummed with power so intense they could serve as hinges between realities. These were the days chosen for time loop rituals, when the veil between cycles grew thin enough to pierce. To understand how these dates were selected, picture the Tonalpohualli as a celestial loom. Every 52 years, it interlaced with the solar calendar in what the Aztecs called the binding of the years, a moment of cosmic vulnerability. But within that greater cycle, smaller alignments crackled with potential. Days ruled by Ehecatl, the wind god, were favored for rituals meant to rewind disasters. Historians speculate priests reenacted myths of storms being calmed on these dates, stitching past miracles into the present. Meanwhile, Tezcatlipoca, the primordial crocodile's day, was reserved for anchoring beginnings like coronations or temple foundations. Surviving codices show priests cross-referencing these signs with celestial events. A blood moon on Ehecatl, the serpent day, might trigger a ritual to loop protection spells from a victorious battle centuries prior. But the true art lay in resonance. A time loop wasn't just about picking a potent day, it required mirroring every detail of the original event. If a king won a battle on Ozomatli, the monkey's day, amid a Venus rise, priests would wait for that exact alignment to recur. Then, dressed identically to the ancient warriors, they'd replicate every chant, every sacrifice down to the placement of blood droplets. The goal wasn't just repetition, it was harmonic convergence, a vibration so precise it tricked time into folding. Spanish chroniclers wrote of witnesses who claimed to see ghostly doubles during these rites, echoes of the past flickering beside the living. Yet the calendar wasn't a tool of control, it was a pact with chaos. Days under Tezcatlipoca, the dog sign, were notoriously unstable, ideal for breaking curses but prone to spiraling. One codex fragment tells of a priest who tried to undo a drought on such a day, only to loop his village into a 3-day eclipse until the ritual was inverted. That's why every date carried caveats. Kali, the house sign, offered stability but resisted change, while Tezcatlipoca, the flint knife, cut swift loops but risked severing timelines entirely. The Tonalpohualli was less a schedule than a dialogue with forces even the gods approached with care. Modern scholars still puzzle over fragments of chant lyrics hinting at how these loops were closed. Some suggest the key lay in the calendar's asymmetry. 260 days don't divide neatly, leaving a remainder of energy. By stopping a ritual at the 259th day, priests may have created a temporal eddy, a pocket where moments could overlap. Others point to the Xiuhpohualli, the ceremonial bundles burned every 52 years as reset points, preventing loops from multiplying. But the deepest truth might be in the name itself. Tonalpohualli translates to the count of our souls. For the Aztecs, time wasn't out there, it was in them, woven into breath and blood. To loop it wasn't magic, it was memory amplified to the scale of the cosmos. The Xiuhpohualli wasn't just a calendar, it was a lifeline. While the sacred Tonalpohualli mapped spiritual cycles, the 365-day solar calendar, known as Xiuhpohualli, governed the tangible world, harvests, wars, the rise and fall of kings. But to the Aztec priests it held a far darker purpose. They believed the sun itself could be restarted like a dying flame, and within this calendar lay the instructions for doing so. Every 52 years, when the Xiuhpohualli and Tonalpohualli aligned, the Aztecs performed the new fire ceremony, a ritual so critical entire cities held their breath. At midnight, priests would extinguish every hearth in the empire. If the stars confirmed the world would continue, they'd light a new fire in a captive's chest, sending runners to reignite civilization. But some texts suggest this was more than symbolism. The ceremony may have been a failsafe, a way to literally reset time if the cosmic cycle faltered. The most chilling account comes from the fall of Tenochtitlan. As Spanish ships appeared on the horizon, Moctezuma II reportedly ordered priests to consult the Xiuhpohualli for an emergency reset. The logic was desperate but precise. If the empire's founding in 1325 could be ritually recreated during the same celestial alignment, perhaps history would loop, granting them a second chance. Chronicles describe priests scouring archives for the exact date, star positions, even the clothing worn by their ancestors. On the chosen night, they gathered in the Templo Mayor, sacrificing captives in sequences mirroring ancient rites. Witnesses later claimed the air shimmered as if the temple were submerged in water, a sign time was bending. Then catastrophe. Conquistador Bernal Diaz wrote of a great tearing sound echoing across the lake, followed by silence. The Spanish interpreted it as thunder, but Aztec survivors whispered otherwise. The ritual had snapped. What went wrong? Fragments of Moctezuma's personal codex hint at a fatal miscalculation. The original founding aligned with Venus as the morning star, but in 1519 Venus was descending. The asymmetry fractured the loop. Some say this explains Moctezuma's infamous paralysis. Meeting Cortés, he may have glimpsed echoes of a timeline where the Spaniards arrived centuries earlier, merging past and present. Others point to the Spanish chronicles themselves as evidence of a partial reset. Accounts contradict each other bizarrely. Cortés is described entering Tenochtitlan on 3 different dates, and Aztec warriors reported fighting the same battles twice. Even today, archaeologists find anomalous Spanish armor in layers predating their arrival, Aztec glyphs depicting horses before contact. The deeper truth may lie in the Xiuhpohualli structure. Unlike our linear calendar, it was divided into 18 months of 20 days plus 5 ominous hollow days called Nemontemi. These days were considered outside time, a gap where the rules unraveled. Priests avoided all rituals then, but Moctezuma's desperate attempt fell on the 4th Nemontemi. Perhaps that's why the ritual didn't fail, it backfired, stitching fragments of alternate histories into reality. Spanish friars later burned most Xiuhpohualli texts, but surviving pages show eerie annotations. Next to the 1519 entry, one priest scribbled a warning in Nahuatl. The sun moved backward, but the shadow stayed. Whether metaphor or confession, one thing is clear: the Aztecs didn't just track time. They wrestled with it, and sometimes time wrestled back. The 5 Nemontemi days sat at the end of the Aztec solar year like a gaping wound in time itself. Considered so unlucky, they were called the Days of Nothing. These were moments outside the cosmic order when calendars fell silent, fires went cold, and even the gods held their breath. For ordinary people, the Nemontemi were a time of dread. Children born during these days were thought to be cursed, marriages forbidden, and travelers warned to stay inside lest they step into the void. But for the priests, these hollow days held a darker allure. If time truly stopped during the Nemontemi, then within that stillness perhaps it could be stretched. Ancient glyphs depict a secret ritual known as the stretching of shadows, performed only during these empty days. Priests would select a sacrificial victim, often a captured warrior whose bravery might anchor the spell, and bind them to a stone etched with temporal glyphs. As the sun reached its zenith on the 1st Nemontemi day, they'd begin chanting backward through sacred verses, literally reversing the flow of words. Witness accounts describe how the victim's shadow would slowly detach from their body, growing longer even as the sun remained motionless. This was the key. By manipulating shadows time's visible fingerprints, priests believed they could dilate moments of crisis. A drought predicted for the coming year might be postponed by looping these 5 empty days into 7 or 9, buying time for rains to return. But the ritual's true horror lay in its unintended consequences. A codex recovered from Texcoco details what happened when priests attempted to loop the Nemontemi during a plague year. The victim's shadow split into 5 copies, each representing a day, and by chanting, the priest successfully stretched it to 7 shadows. The plague did delay, but at a cost. Survivors reported nights that lasted 50 hours, crops that ripened and rotted in a single afternoon, and elders who aged decades before dawn. The priests realized too late that bending empty days wasn't like looping ordinary time. With no celestial anchors, the stretched Nemontemi became a temporal whirlpool, dragging fragments of the future into the present. Why risk such chaos? Because the alternative was worse. The Aztecs believed the Nemontemi weren't just empty, they were diagnostic. Like a pause between heartbeats, these days revealed the health of the coming cycle. If rituals performed during them showed omens of famine or war, looping the days might allow priests to edit the future. One fragmentary text describes a high priest who, during the reign of Moctezuma I, allegedly prevented an earthquake by sacrificing a jaguar on a mirrored altar, its thrashing limbs supposedly absorbing the coming tremor into the Nemontemi's void. The quake came anyway, but split across 5 minor tremors over a decade, proving the loop had worked imperfectly. Most terrifying of all were the whispers of unmade days. Some codices hint that if the Nemontemi rituals failed catastrophically, the looped days might not just stretch, they could multiply. A damaged mural at Teotihuacan shows a priest surrounded by 10 black suns, suggesting a ceremony where 5 empty days became 10. Colonial records mention Aztec prisoners warning Spaniards not to march during the Nemontemi, lest they find themselves walking the same road forever. Perhaps this explains one of history's oddest anomalies. Spanish accounts of their entrada describe passing the same abandoned shrine 3 times in identical lighting, though maps show no such loop in the terrain. The Nemontemi's power didn't vanish with the Aztec Empire. Modern Mexico descendants still mark these days with silence, refusing even to sweep their floors, as if movement might disturb time's fragile seams. Scientists note something eerie. Seismic activity in central Mexico still peaks anomalously during the Nemontemi's traditional dates, as if the earth itself remembers when time was meant to pause. The deepest lesson might be in the name itself. Nemontemi doesn't just mean empty days. In some dialects, it translates closer to the days that were never born. A warning, perhaps, that some gaps in time aren't meant to be filled. To the Aztecs, blood wasn't just sacred, it was the very currency of time itself. They saw it as a liquid thread connecting all existence, a substance so potent it could grease the gears of the cosmos. When a priest plunged an obsidian blade into a captive's chest, he wasn't just offering a life to the gods, he was extracting temporal energy. The still beating heart, held aloft to the sun, was believed to contain Tonalpohualli, the animating force that kept both humans and the universe moving forward. Sacrifices weren't merely acts of devotion, they were desperate attempts to refuel time's engine, especially when history threatened to stutter or repeat. The most chilling example of this was the Tezcatlipoca festival, where warriors captured in battle were ritually transformed into living timepieces. After their hearts were removed, their skins were worn by priests for 20 days, a gruesome reenactment of the flaying of the god Xiuhpohualli, who renewed the earth by shedding his own skin. But here's the twisted brilliance. The Aztecs saw this as a literal reset. By dressing in the victim's flesh, the priest became a walking temporal echo, his movements syncing with the original sacrifice until the 20 days folded back into themselves like a coiled serpent. Surviving glyphs show captives marked with calendrical symbols on their chests, turning their bodies into living almanacs. A victim sacrificed on the day Xiuhpohualli eagle might be flayed so his skin could carry that date's energy into another cycle, delaying disaster. For rulers, blood held an even darker promise, the illusion of immortality. When Moctezuma II fell ill, chroniclers describe a secret rite where prisoners were sacrificed in reverse order of their capture, their hearts stacked like kindling around his bed. The logic was macabre but precise. By unspooling the sequence of deaths, priests hoped to rewind the emperor's decline. Some scholars argue this explains Aztec kings' notoriously short reigns. Each succession may have triggered mass sacrifices to repay the stolen time. A recently deciphered codex from Texcoco describes a king who, after reigning 52 years, a full calendar cycle, ordered the sacrifice of 52 nobles, one for each year he'd borrowed. The glyph shows their blood funneled into a solar disk, a grim transaction to balance the cosmic ledger, but the true horror lay in the rituals gone wrong. Spanish friars documented accounts of Tezcatlipoca star demons descending during botched sacrifices, their skeletal fingers pulling at the edges of reality. One priest's journal tells of a victim whose heart refused to stop beating after removal, causing the temple's shadows to pulse backward for hours. Warriors stationed outside claimed to hear battle cries from future conflicts echoing in the air, suggesting the blood had torn a temporary rift. The Aztecs called this phenomenon Nahualli, the unsteady time, and feared it above all else. To them, blood was a scalpel for sculpting time, but wielded carelessly, it could cut straight through the fabric of existence. Among the Aztecs' most feared artifacts was the Tezcatl, the smoking mirror of Tezcatlipoca, god of night, sorcery, and the unseen. Unlike ordinary obsidian mirrors, these weren't just polished stone, they were portals. Crafted from volcanic glass and consecrated with the breath of dying men, they shimmered with more than reflections. Priests claimed that when held under the right stars, the mirror's surface didn't show your face, it showed your other lives, the paths you might have taken, or the futures you'd never live to see. But the mirrors had a hunger, gaze too long and they'd pull you in. The ritual to activate one was called Xiuhpohualli, the seeing. A priest would fast for 13 nights, then at midnight position the mirror to catch the light of the Pleiades. As the star's glow slithered across the glass, he'd smear it with a paste of hallucinogenic mushrooms and his own blood, whispering Tezcatlipoca's secret names. Witnesses described how the surface would first ripple like water, then darken into smoke, not covering the reflection but replacing it. Instead of his own face, the priest might see a marketplace burning years in the future, or a stranger wearing his features, speaking in a tongue no one recognized. The bravest or most reckless diviners would press their foreheads to the glass, letting the smoke swallow them whole. What happened next is ripped from nightmares. Accounts from the Florentine Codex tell of priests who returned from the mirrors with their pupils turned silver, babbling prophecies in reverse. Others emerged clutching objects that shouldn't exist, jade carved with unfamiliar gods, maps of cities that hadn't been built. One diviner, Ehecatl, allegedly stepped into a mirror during Moctezuma's reign and returned moments later, his hair white, insisting he'd lived 40 years in a world where the Spanish never came. His final words before choking on black smoke: "The mirror doesn't show what could be, it shows what already was somewhere else, but not everyone came back." Spanish chronicler Diego Duran recorded an eerie confession from an Aztec elder. Of 7 priests who attempted the Xiuhpohualli during a lunar eclipse, only 6 reappeared, and the 7th screams continued to echo from the mirror for weeks. Worse still were the things that sometimes crawled out in their place. A fragment from the lost Codex Xiuhpohualli warns of the faceless ones, beings who wore priest skins but moved wrong, their limbs bending at impossible angles. These weren't demons, the text insists, but travelers from the roads not taken, strands of time that had frayed loose. The mirror's true purpose might lie in Tezcatlipoca's own mythos. As a god who traded his foot for cosmic knowledge, he represented sacrifice as a doorway. His mirrors weren't just tools, they were wounds in reality, places where the Aztec obsession with cyclical time became tangible. To look into one was to confront the unbearable truth that every choice spawned infinite worlds, and that some of those worlds might be looking back. Modern archaeologists have noted something unsettling. Of the few Tezcatl mirrors that survive, all show microscopic cracks radiating from their centers, as if something inside them is still trying to get out. When an Aztec city faced catastrophe, whether from invasion, famine, or a storm that flattened temples, the priests didn't just rebuild, they rewrote. Enter the rituals of Ehecatl, the wind god whose breath could scour events from history itself. Unlike typical sacrifices meant to appease the gods, these ceremonies were acts of cosmic editing. The goal wasn't forgiveness, it was erasure. Imagine a battle lost, hundreds slain, the enemy marching closer. Instead of retreating, the priests would gather at dusk on a day marked by swirling winds, their cloaks sewn with feathers to mimic Ehecatl's flight. They'd burn not just incense, but entire codices recording the defeat, whispering a single phrase into the smoke: "Let the wind carry this away," as if it never was. The ritual's power lay in its cruel precision. First, priests would identify every physical trace of the event: broken weapons, blood-stained stones, even the memories of survivors. Captives taken in the battle were forced to reenact their victory, but with a horrifying twist. The moment their blades struck the killing blow, priests would slit their throats mid-motion, freezing the action like a distorted mural. Their bodies were then arranged in poses of surrender, a grotesque rewrite of history's script. Next came the wind invocation, using conch shells carved with spirals, symbols of time's cyclical nature. They'd mimic Ehecatl's howl, blowing the shells toward the 4 cardinal directions. Surviving texts claim this wasn't just ritual theater. the shell's pitch allegedly synced with a frequency that unwove events from the fabric of reality. Spanish chronicler Bernardino de Sahagún recorded an elder's confession. After one such ceremony, warriors who died in battle were seen walking the streets days later, confused but alive, their wounds replaced by fresh tattoos of swirling wind. But the true test of the ritual's success was the aftermath. All participants, even priests, underwent memory purges. They'd drink bitter infusions of Tezcatlipoca flowers, which induced vomiting along with selective amnesia. Temples were scrubbed with sand until the stones bled powder, removing not just bloodstains but the very grooves left by weapons. Children born on the day of the erased event were given names meaning wind's gift, their birth dates adjusted in the calendars. The Aztecs understood something modern science confirms: memory is physical. By altering every record, every object, even the body's chemistry, they believed they could collapse an event's reality. Yet sometimes the wind refused to obey. A codex fragment from Texcoco describes a ritual gone awry after a flood. Priests performed the ceremony flawlessly, burned the records, silenced the witnesses, but the next morning the waterlogged ruins remained. Panicked, they consulted the Tonalpohualli and realized their fatal error. They'd chosen a day aligned with Xiuhpohualli, goddess of rivers, whose influence anchored the disaster too firmly to be lifted. The backlash was swift. Survivors reported phantom rains falling indoors, statues of Ehecatl cracking as if struck, and worst of all, ghosts of the drowned flickering at the edges of vision, caught between the timeline that was and the one that never happened. The most unsettling evidence of these rituals' power lies in modern archaeology. At the Templo Mayor site, excavators found a layer of artifacts that defies explanation. Spanish muskets buried beneath construction layers predating Cortés' arrival, their barrels filled with feathers instead of gunpowder. One theory suggests these were remnants of a desperate Ehecatl ritual, an attempt to erase the conquest before it began. If so, the wind god's reply was merciless. The weapons weren't erased, just displaced, left to taunt future generations with the chilling possibility that some events are too heavy even for the wind to carry. The so-called flower wars were never just battles, they were blood transactions, a brutal economy where time itself was the currency. To the Aztecs, these staged conflicts weren't about territory or conquest, they were desperate negotiations with the cosmos. When priests prophesied that the fifth sun's cycle was waning, they didn't pray for mercy. They declared war, but not against enemies, against time. Capturing warriors alive became a sacred imperative because their beating hearts held the tonally needed to purchase more days, months, or even years before the world's inevitable collapse. The ritual mechanics were chillingly precise. Before a flower war, priests would consult the Tonalpohualli to identify a payment date, a day when the universe's energy could be most easily manipulated. Warriors from rival city-states like Tlaxcala were lured into ceremonial battles where the goal wasn't victory but symmetry. Survivors described formations moving in perfect mirrored patterns, their steps echoing older battles myth claimed had delayed previous apocalypses. Captives weren't just taken, they were selected. A warrior who fought fiercely under the sign Xiuhpohualli eagle might be spared death for weeks until his sacred alignment repeated, making his sacrifice temporally interest-bearing. As the Spanish threat loomed, these rituals spiraled into madness. Moctezuma Roman II reign saw flower wars erupting monthly, with thousands captured in a single day. Spanish accounts describe confused conquistadors witnessing battles where Aztec warriors threw down their weapons mid-fight to bind prisoners with flower garlands. What Cortés interpreted as surrender was actually harvest. Codices from this period show priests calculating interest rates on borrowed time. Each captive's blood was believed to buy 13 days, but only if spilled on an altar inscribed with the victim's birth date. The math grew frantic. One fragment records 80,000 sacrifices in a single year, a grisly attempt to prepay the next cosmic cycle. The backlash was catastrophic. Rival nations, weary of being bled dry, began sending diseased or elderly prisoners. Worse, some Tezcatlipoca warriors reportedly carved false calendar glyphs into their flesh before capture, poisoning the temporal transaction. The Aztecs called this Tezcatlipoca cosmic pollution and blamed it for the eerie failures that followed. Priests performing sacrifices found hearts turning black before extraction, their tonality already spent. Templo Mayor's stones began sweating blood weeks after ceremonies, a sign the gods were rejecting payments. By the time Cortés reached Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs were trapped in a paradox of their own making. Their desperate attempts to stretch time had twisted it instead. Survivors reported seeing double suns in the sky, rivers flowing backward, and worst of all, their own ancestors walking the streets, seemingly pulled from earlier cycles by the ritual's cumulative weight. The Spanish didn't just conquer an empire, they interrupted a bargain with eternity mid-transaction. The unpaid debt may still be coming due. Modern seismologists note that Mexico's deadliest earthquakes consistently strike on dates aligning with the final, incomplete flower war sacrifices. Coincidence or time finally collecting what it was owed? Every 52 years, the Aztec world stood on the brink of annihilation, and their priests had a ritual to cheat fate. The binding of the year's ceremony, known as Xiuhpohualli, wasn't just a celebration, it was a cosmic reset button. As the final day of the 52-year cycle approached, entire cities fell silent. No fires burned, no children laughed, even pottery wheels stopped spinning, lest their motion mimic the grinding halt of the cosmos. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the stars aligned correctly, priests would light a new sacred fire in the chest cavity of a sacrificial victim, reigniting time itself. But if they failed, the sun would vanish forever, plunging the world into eternal darkness or worse, trapping it in an endless loop of the same 52 years. The preparation was excruciating. For 5 days prior, priests ascended the snow-capped peak of Mount Ehecatl, their bare feet bleeding on the volcanic rock. At the summit, they fasted beneath the open sky, tracking the Pleiades constellation's movement with obsidian mirrors. The moment those stars crossed the zenith at midnight, the high priest would plunge a fire drill into the breastbone of a captive warrior. Success meant watching the first spark catch, a sign the gods had accepted their bargain. Teams of runners would then carry torches lit from that flame to every temple, hearth, and field in the empire. But failure, the consequences were whispered in terrified tones. Codices describe villages where the new fire never arrived, settlements found empty at dawn, meals half-eaten, sandals still warm, as if every inhabitant had vanished mid-step. Some legends suggest these weren't mere tragedies, but temporal collapses. A fragment from the Codex Tonalpohualli tells of a village called Aztec, whose priests grew impatient and performed the ritual 6 days early. As the false fire spread, witnesses claimed the stars began moving backward. By morning, Aztec's pyramid stood overgrown with centuries of jungle, its altars inscribed with names of kings who wouldn't be born for generations. The Aztecs called this Tezcatlipoca, the place where time stumbles, and marked it with skulls carved from meteorite iron, a warning against tampering with the cycle. Spanish chroniclers added their own eerie postscript. After the conquest, a missionary in Toluca documented an elderly Aztec man's confession. His grandfather had survived a botched new fire ceremony in 1467. The old man described watching his village priest's hands turn translucent mid-ritual, the fire drill passing through his body like smoke. Within hours, every visible shadow froze at the same angle, unmoving even as the sun crossed the sky. Survivors fled, but those who lingered reported something impossible. The same 5 days repeated for 2 months until a neighboring city's successful ceremony unstuck them. The priest, he remained in the temple, aging decades in minutes, his final screams allegedly still audible during thunderstorms. Modern archaeologists have found evidence that deepens the mystery. Excavations near Teotihuacan revealed a mass grave of skeletons from the 1500s, all bearing identical sacrificial wounds, but carbon dating showed some bones were centuries older, as if pulled backward through time. Even stranger, a recent study of tree rings in central Mexico shows a bizarre anomaly: 52-year growth patterns repeating exactly in multiple groves, down to the microscopic level. Scientists can't explain it, but the Aztecs might have. Their greatest fear wasn't that time would end. It was that it might get stuck, playing the same nightmare over and over, with no one left to light the fire that could set it free. Among the Aztecs' most bizarre time-twisting myths was the legend of Tonalpohualli, the two-faced rabbit god of intoxication. Unlike other deities who demanded blood, this trickster demanded something far stranger: repetition. Drunk on pulque, the fermented sap of the maguey plant, Tonalpohualli was said to stumble through the same day over and over, his paws eternally fumbling for another gourd of liquor. But this wasn't just a cautionary tale about excess. Priests who studied Tonalpohualli's cycles discovered something terrifying: inebriation could bend time. Every 52 years during the new fire ceremony, selected priests would recreate the god's ritual. After drinking pulque blended with morning glory seeds, they'd enact the same motion: stumbling, laughing, collapsing, in precise loops lasting exactly 480 minutes, mirroring the rabbit god's mythical day. Survivors' accounts describe eerie lapses. A priest would drop his cup only to find it back in his hand moments later, the liquid undisturbed. Some claim to see their own silhouettes moving ahead of them like echoes, performing actions they hadn't done yet. The goal wasn't just worship, it was testing the boundaries of time's elasticity. Modern archaeologists have found disturbing evidence supporting these accounts. Beneath the Pyramid of the Moon at Teotihuacan, researchers uncovered a chamber filled with shattered pulque vessels arranged in perfect concentric circles. Each shard bore microscopic traces of psilocybin alongside calendar glyphs for the same date. But here's the chilling detail: carbon dating showed some fragments were centuries older than others, as if the ritual had somehow pulled artifacts backward through time. Even stranger are the contemporary reports from tourists visiting the site. Since the 2000s, over 3 dozen visitors have reported experiencing lost hours near the pyramid, claiming they briefly saw the ruins restored to their original painted glory before snapping back to reality. One particularly well-documented case occurred in 2019 when a French anthropologist named Dr. Elodie March and insisted she'd lived the same 30 minutes twice. Her GPS data showed her circling the same 10-meter stretch for an hour, though she recalled visiting multiple temples. Security footage confirmed her path, but with an unnatural twist. In the video, she's seen conversing with someone just out of frame, though no one else was recorded entering the area. When shown the footage, Marchand turned pale. The person she described wore a rabbit skin robe and smelled of fermented agave, details matching Tonalpohualli's depiction in codices. Scientists dismiss these accounts as hallucinogenic residue from ancient rituals seeping into the soil. But the Aztecs would have understood. They believed drunkenness didn't distort perception, it revealed time's true fluidity. A surviving prayer to Tonalpohualli puts it eerily: "Let me be foolish enough to see the same sun rise twice, that I may learn what the sober forget." Perhaps some doors, once opened by pulque and psilocybin, never fully close. Visitors to Teotihuacan still leave offerings of alcohol at the pyramid's base, not for the gods, but for the gaps in time where Tonalpohualli's laughter still echoes. In the shadowy corners of Aztec spirituality, where gods governed not just actions but the very weight of guilt, stood Tlazolteotl, the eater of filth. Unlike other deities who demanded purity, she thrived in humanity's messiest moments. But her priests didn't just absolve sins, they offered something far more unnerving: the chance to relive them. Imagine confessing a mistake, not to erase it, but to loop back and make the choice again. This wasn't forgiveness, it was temporal surgery. The ritual began at crossroads, literal and symbolic. A penitent would kneel before a priest at dusk, their body painted with ashes from burned codices, symbolizing the past's fragility. The priest, wearing a mask of spun cotton to mimic Tezcatlipoca's ever-shifting face, would press a jade knife to the confessor's chest, not to draw blood, but to cut the thread of their mistake. Then came the hallucinogens, a paste of morning glory seeds and fermented maize, that plunged the penitent into a waking dream. Survivors described seeing their past selves frozen mid-action like figures in a mural. The priest would chant backward through the sacred calendar, unraveling time until the moment of regret hovered before them, tangible as a bead of sweat. Here's where it turned chilling. The penitent could push. Spanish friars documented cases where merchants who'd cheated partners emerged from the ritual claiming to have repaid the debt in another life, or warriors who'd failed in battle swore they'd felt their swords strike true this time. But the loops were never clean. A codex from Tlaxcala depicts a woman who relived her son's death 16 times, each iteration distorting further. By the end, she described his face melting like wax, his voice coming from the wrong direction. The Aztecs called this Tlaxcalmiquistli, filthy death, a warning that some doors, once opened, couldn't be fully closed. Colonial authorities didn't just ban these rituals. They burned the temples where Tezcatl was worshipped and salted the earth to prevent rebuilding. But something lingered. In 1723, a Spanish magistrate in Puebla wrote of arresting an old man who claimed to have eaten a murderer's crime by performing a modified version of the rite. Under interrogation, the man, who had no known ties to Aztec culture, described details matching pre-conquest texts: the cotton mask, the jade knife, even the exact hallucinogenic brew. When asked how he knew, he allegedly laughed and said, "I didn't, he did." He was never identified, but the magistrate's notes end with a chilling addendum. The next morning, the prisoner's cell was empty, the lock untouched, and the floor covered in footprints leading into the wall. Modern psychologists studying obsessive guilt note something peculiar. Patients in central Mexico still report dreams where they relive mistakes with slight variations, as if stuck in Tlaxcal's loop. One woman in Mexico City swore she'd lived the same argument with her mother 40 times, each version ending with a whisper in Nahuatl she couldn't understand, until a linguist identified it as a phrase from the sin-eating rites. The thread is cut, but the knot remains. Perhaps some rituals don't end, they just wear new skins. Deep in the vaults of Mexico's National Museum of Anthropology lies an artifact so unsettling. Even seasoned archaeologists handle it with gloved hands, a jade mask so finely carved, its hollow eyes seem to follow you across the room. But this isn't just a funeral relic. According to Aztec legends, this was the Ehecatl of Tezcatli, the fire god, a vessel designed not to honor the dead but to cheat death itself. Whispers among the surviving codices tell of rulers who donned this mask during the new fire ceremony, their faces pressed against the cool stone as priests chanted verses meant to lock their youth in place. The promise, a single perfect moment stretched across a lifetime. The mask's design reveals its sinister purpose. Unlike typical burial masks which depict serene faces, this one shows lips slightly parted, not in repose but mid-breath. Microscopic analysis reveals something even stranger. The inner surface is etched with minuscule spirals, matching the sacred melanelli grass symbolizing cyclical time. Worn during a solar eclipse or the zenith passage of Venus, the grooves allegedly caught the wearers tonally, their life force, like a net. Spanish chronicler Diego de Ron wrote of Emperor Ehecatl, who reportedly wore the mask for 3 days after a near-fatal battle wound. When he removed it, his generals gasped the injury had vanished, but his eyes, they flickered like candle flames seen through water. Modern excavations have unearthed similar masks across Mesoamerica, each with eerie anomalies. In 2016, beneath the ruins of Tlaxcal's marketplace, archaeologists found a jade mask clutched by a skeleton, but the bones belonged to an elderly man while the mask's dimensions fit a child. Even stranger, isotopic testing revealed the jade came from a Guatemalan mine that hadn't been active since 800 CE, centuries before the burial. The team's lead anthropologist, Dr. Elena Ruiz, described the discovery as a Russian nesting doll of paradoxes, noting the mask's interior bore traces of a chemical compound found in certain hallucinogenic plants. What rituals surrounded these artifacts? The Florentine Codex describes a ceremony called Xiuhpohualli, the turning back. A chosen noble would fast for 13 days, then at midnight, priests would bind the mask to their face with strips of human skin. For the next 52 hours, one for each year in the cosmic cycle, they'd drink only water infused with ground obsidian, a substance believed to cut time's flow. Survivors claimed to experience vivid dreams of reliving their greatest triumphs, but always with a twist. Their younger selves would turn, meeting their gaze with hollow, jade-lined eyes. The most chilling account comes from Texcoco's royal archives. Prince Huhu Zoltan, desperate to regain his battlefield vigor, wore a similar mask during a lunar eclipse. When priests removed it 3 days later, his face was unlined, his muscles taut, but he couldn't recognize anyone. He spoke flawless Nahuatl, but it was the dialect of 2 centuries prior. Within months, he began crumbling like sun-baked clay, his body aging decades in minutes until only the mask remained, resting atop a pile of dust that still smelled of copal incense. Why would the Aztecs risk such horrors? Because to them, youth wasn't just vitality, it was a temporal anchor. Elders were revered, but warriors needed the reflexes of their prime. The masks offered a brutal solution: loop a sliver of your peak forever, even if the cost was losing everything else. Today, visitors to the museum swear the jade mask's expression changes when viewed from different angles, sometimes smiling, sometimes screaming. Perhaps it still is. When drought gripped the Aztec Empire and crops withered under an unrelenting sun, priests turned to one of their most desperate rituals, the eagle's flight. More than just a symbolic dance, this was an act of temporal desperation, an attempt to literally accelerate time itself past the famine's grip. Dressed in eagle feathers dipped in liquid gold to mimic the sun's radiance, priests would ascend pyramid steps in precise spirals, their movements mirroring the sacred bird's ascent to the heavens. Each step was a calculated gamble. By aligning their bodies with the sun's path at zenith, they believed they could pull time forward like thread through a needle's eye. The surviving Codex Mendoza depicts this ritual in chilling detail. One panel shows a priest mid-leap from a pyramid summit, his feathered arms outstretched, while scribes below mark not just his descent, but a series of sun glyphs rapidly progressing across the page, as if his fall spanned weeks rather than seconds. Accompanying glyphs warn of the price. He burns the days of his life as tinder. The faster time was forced forward, the more the priest's own tonally his life force was consumed. Some codices describe participants aging visibly during the ceremony, their hair whitening and skin wrinkling as years compressed into moments. Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagun recorded an eyewitness account from a surviving temple attendant. During a brutal famine in 1510, High Priest Cuauhtlazin performed the eagle's flight atop the Templo Mayor. As he reached the summit, witnesses claimed the sun visibly stuttered in the sky, shadows flickering like candle flames in wind. By dusk, the first rains came, but Cuauhtlazin collapsed into dust upon touching the ground, his body reduced to a skeletal figure wrapped in loose, aged skin. The attendant swore the priest's final words were not in Nahuatl, but in a dialect no one recognized, a language that wouldn't exist for another century. Archaeology offers eerie corroboration. Excavations near Tenochtitlan's ruins uncovered a cluster of skeletons buried in eagle feather regalia, all showing advanced osteoporosis and tooth wear inconsistent with their muscle attachments, bodies that had aged unevenly, as if parts of them had lived decades longer than the rest. One set of remains, carbon dated to the Great Drought of 1454, held a jade pendant engraved with a glyph meaning borrowed days. the ritual's true danger lay in its imprecision. Unlike other time loops that targeted specific events, the eagle's flight yanked blindly at time's fabric. A codex fragment from Texcoco describes a ceremony where priests overcorrected, accelerating their city through a 12-year famine in 3 days, only to emerge into a plague no one remembered predicting. Worse still were the accounts of stuck eagles, priests mid-ritual when the alignment broke, left hovering at the pyramid's edge as their shadows continued moving without them. These half-looped figures allegedly haunted the temples, their voices echoing from moments that hadn't happened yet. Why risk such horror? Because to the Aztecs, starvation wasn't just suffering, it was cosmic dysfunction. If the sun could rise on schedule, so too should rain. The eagle's flight wasn't arrogance, it was the last resort of a civilization bargaining with time itself, trading lifespans for survival. Modern meteorologists might scoff, but they can't explain why droughts in central Mexico still break with sudden, localized rains, often on dates matching these ancient rituals. Perhaps some winds still carry echoes of golden feathers, still pulling time forward for those desperate enough to try. Deep in the vaults of an abandoned Aztec noble's house, scribes once recorded a horror no one dared name aloud, the moment a lord's shadow stopped mimicking his movements. According to post-conquest texts, certain Aztec elites practiced a forbidden rite called Tonalpohualli, the shadow-soul exchange. This wasn't mere superstition, it was a calculated bid to outwit death itself. The logic was as chilling as it was precise. If time could be looped, perhaps consciousness could too, by anchoring the soul not to flesh but to the darkness it cast. The ritual began at high noon when shadows were shortest and thus most concentrated. A noble would stand atop a pyramid steps, his body anointed with resin from the copal tree, a substance believed to glue the soul to the physical world. Priests would chant backward through the noble's life story, from his latest battle to his first breath, while attendants measured his shadow with ropes woven from human hair. At the chant's climax, the noble would plunge an obsidian blade into his own shadow's heart, or where it would be if the sun were lower. Survivors described the effect as instantaneous. The noble's physical body would collapse, but his shadow would remain standing, flickering with intelligence. The Codex Aubin tells of Lord Zipilli, who performed this ritual as Spanish forces stormed Tenochtitlan. Witnesses claimed his corpse lay lifeless in the temple, yet his shadow led a battalion of warriors for 3 more days until a conquistador, noticing the anomaly, cut it in half with a crucifix. The shadow allegedly dissolved into smoke, but not before uttering a sentence in Zipilli's voice: "I will find another darkness." Modern physicists might scoff, but consider this: shadows are the only objects that defy time's arrow. They can grow longer or shorter, but never age. The Aztecs grasped this paradox. By transferring consciousness to a shadow, nobles weren't just cheating death. They were slipping into a loophole where time's rules didn't apply. Spanish chroniclers wrote of encountering shadowless nobles years after their recorded deaths, their bodies eerily cold, their eyes reflecting light but casting no darkness. One friar described a noblewoman who outlived her grandchildren, her skin translucent as if stretched over borrowed time. Yet the ritual had a fatal flaw. Shadows require light, and light fades. The Florentine Codex warns of nobles who dissipated at dusk, their consciousness unraveling with the twilight. Others reportedly became trapped in cycles of their own demise, reliving their deaths nightly when their shadows lengthened to the exact position of the original ritual. The most chilling account comes from a Tlaxcalan scribe who wrote of a noble's shadow that haunted a courtyard for decades, whispering the same phrase every sunset: "The knife was supposed to free me." Archaeologists have found eerie evidence supporting these tales. In 1984, beneath a Mexico City courthouse, workers uncovered a sealed chamber containing 7 headless skeletons, each with a single jade bead placed where their shadows' throats would have been at noon. Carbon dating placed the bones in the 1500s, but the beads matched mining patterns from 2 centuries earlier. Perhaps these were failed participants, their souls stranded between light and dark. The ultimate tragedy: even if the ritual worked, it traded one prison for another. A shadow can't age, but it can't change either. To loop consciousness this way was to freeze it mid-breath, forever grasping at a life that kept slipping further into the past. The Aztecs understood time as a wheel, but they forgot one truth: even wheels need shadows to turn. Tezcatlipoca didn't just play tricks on mortals, he rewrote their reality. Among the Aztecs, this shape-shifting god of night and sorcery was feared not just for his cruelty, but for his ability to bend time itself into knots. His priests, known as the Tezcatlipoca or the Twisted Ones, specialized in rituals designed to create temporal glitches, repeating moments like a scratched record, disorienting enemies into submission. Imagine a battlefield where warriors suddenly relived the same charge 3 times, their muscles burning with déjà vu, or a rival king trapped in a conversation that looped back to its beginning every time he reached for his sword. These weren't illusions, they were carefully engineered fractures in time's flow. The mechanics were as precise as they were terrifying. Before engaging an enemy, priests would identify a hinge moment, a breath between 2 heartbeats, the instant a blade left its sheath, then mark it with a drop of their own blood mixed with ground obsidian. At the exact moment of repetition, they'd blow powdered Ehecatl Aztec marigold into the wind, its pollen believed to stick time's layers together. Survivors described the horror of watching allies freeze mid-swing, only to snap back seconds earlier, their memories intact but their bodies forced to replay the action. The Florentine Codex recounts a siege where Tlaxcalan warriors abandoned their assault after their war chief gave the same order 11 times, his voice growing hoarser with each echo. What makes these accounts even more unnerving are the modern parallels. Visitors to Teotihuacan and Templo Mayor frequently report intense déjà vu, not the fleeting kind, but sustained episodes where they swear they've walked the same path before, down to overhearing identical snippets of conversation. In 2018, a German tourist named Klaus Ritter insisted he'd photographed the same group of children playing near the Pyramid of the Sun 3 times over an hour, except the children weren't there when he reviewed his photos. Security footage showed him circling an empty courtyard, snapping pictures of nothing. Scientists dismiss it as heat exhaustion or magnetic anomalies, but the Aztecs would have recognized it immediately: Tezcatlipoca's fingerprints. Archaeologists have found physical evidence of these rituals. Beneath the Templo Mayor's north side, excavators uncovered a chamber filled with shattered mirrors, Tezcatlipoca's sacred objects arranged in spiral patterns. Each shard bore microscopic traces of Ehecatl pollen and human blood, suggesting they'd been used to aim temporal distortions. Even eerier, some mirror fragments reflected not the room they were in, but blurred images of the same chamber in daylight. The Aztecs believed mirrors were portals to other versions of reality. These artifacts hint that their priests didn't just loop time, they spliced it, grafting fragments of alternate moments into the present. The most chilling detail lies in the god's own mythology. Tezcatlipoca's name means smoking mirror, referencing his missing foot, replaced with obsidian after he lost it in a battle with the earth monster. That obsidian limb wasn't just a prosthesis, it was a metaphor for time's uneven gait. His priests took this literally, limping during rituals to mimic his disjointed rhythm, their uneven steps supposedly knocking time off its axis. Spanish accounts describe captured Tlaxcalan whose executions had to be repeated because witnesses kept seeing them alive afterward, standing calmly in their cells. Why would the Aztecs weaponize déjà vu? Because confusion is the ultimate paralysis. A warrior who doubts his own memory hesitates. A king who can't trust his senses makes fatal errors. Modern psychology confirms this. Déjà vu triggers the brain's conflict resolution systems, draining focus. Tezcatlipoca's priests didn't need to kill their enemies. They just made them question whether they'd already died. Today, near the ruins of Tenochtitlan, locals still warn against answering if you hear your name called twice in the same voice. They say the second call isn't an echo, it's a loop, and loops, as the Aztecs knew, have a habit of pulling you in. In the flower-strewn temples of Xochitl, goddess of fertility and weaving, Aztec midwives performed a ritual that seemed to defy nature's cruelest law, the agony of childbirth. Known as the cocoon ceremony, it began with laboring women being swaddled in layers of sacred silk, spun from the golden threads of native butterflies. As priests chanted verses from the Xiuhpohualli, the ancient book of wisdom, the silk would be woven tighter around their bodies until they resembled human chrysalises. The belief was as poetic as it was profound. Just as a caterpillar's suffering transforms it into something new, a mother's pain could be unraveled and rewoven into joy. But this wasn't mere symbolism. The silk contained a secret, a paste made from ololuqui seeds and toloch, potent hallucinogens that plunged women into a waking dream. Survivors' accounts describe visions of floating through their own labor as spectators, watching their bodies give birth painlessly while their spirits hovered above, cradled by Xochitl's invisible hands. The Florentine Codex records one mother's testimony: "I saw my daughter born twice, once in blood, once in light." Midwives claimed the ritual didn't erase pain so much as redistributed across time, like a tapestry unraveling thread by thread. Spanish conquistadors, however, saw only heresy. To them, the sight of women emerging from shimmering cocoons, their infants silent and wide-eyed as if born from dreams, reeked of witchcraft. Friar Diego de Landa wrote of finding a hidden chamber in Tenochtitlan where silk-wrapped mothers hung from the ceiling, like bats, their chants echoing backward, a detail later proven to be hysterical exaggeration, but enough to fuel the fires of the Inquisition. The Spanish twisted the ritual's purpose, claiming Aztec midwives were stealing babies' souls to fuel their magic. Dozens were burned alive with their own silk, the fabric melting into their skin like grotesque wings. Archaeology hints at a darker truth. Excavations near Xochimilco uncovered jars filled with ololuqui residue alongside tiny silk bundles, each containing a preserved umbilical cord. These weren't trophies but temporal anchors. Aztec glyphs nearby depict mothers revisiting their cocoons annually, retying the silk around their wrists to keep the pain away. Modern obstetricians note something chilling. Descendants of these women still report lower than average childbirth pain thresholds, as if the ritual's effect somehow seeped into their DNA. Yet the cocoon ceremony's greatest tragedy wasn't its suppression, it was its corruption. Post-conquest, fragments of the practice survived in secret, but without sacred butterflies, midwives used ordinary spider silk. The hallucinations turned monstrous, with women screaming of being trapped in their own bodies. By the 1700s, what remained was a parody, a folk remedy where pregnant women wore silk gloves to ease delivery, unaware they were clutching at the frayed threads of a goddess's forgotten grace. Today, in remote villages of Morlos, you might still find elders who whisper of Xochitl's promise, that all suffering is just cloth waiting to be rewoven. But the silks are gone, the butterflies extinct, and the only remnants are museum displays of empty cocoons, their golden strands dulled under glass, a testament to the cruelest twist of all. Some threads once cut can never be tied again. The intoxicating brew known as pulque wasn't just a drink to the Aztecs, it was a time machine. Fermented from the sap of the maguey plant, this milky liquid held a sacred darkness at its core. When consumed during carefully calculated rituals, pulque didn't merely cloud the mind, it shattered the boundaries of lived experience. Priests seeking visions would drink it from hollowed-out gourds painted with spirals, the same symbol used to represent cyclical time. But this was no ordinary trance. Those who drank under the watch of the moon god mostly reported losing days, weeks, even entire seasons in what felt like mere hours. Their bodies remained motionless, but their consciousness, that hurtled through time like a stone skimming across water. Spanish friars documented the most disturbing cases. In 1542, a missionary named Fray Gaspar de Leon stumbled upon a village near Chapultepec where every inhabitant lay motionless in the central square, their lips stained blue from pulque, their chests rising and falling at half the normal rate. When he shook one man awake, the villager screamed that he'd just spent 6 months trapped in a drought-stricken future, watching his children wither to bones. The others, they never stirred. De Leon's journals describe returning a week later to find the village empty, not abandoned, but unnaturally vacant. Meals sat half-eaten, tools mid-use, as if the entire population had vanished between heartbeats. Locals whispered that the pulque had fermented too long, looping the drinkers into a time without end. Modern chemists analyzing ancient pulque vessels found traces of morning glory seeds and a rare fungus called ergot, both known to distort temporal perception. But the Aztecs understood something science is only now uncovering. The true power lay in the ritual, not just the ingredients. Participants were always seated in concentric circles mirroring the calendar's layout, with the eldest at the center. As the pulque took hold, priests would chant numbers backward from 13, the sacred count of the upper worlds. This wasn't random, it created a cognitive dissonance that, combined with the brew, allowed the mind to slip between temporal layers. The darkest accounts come from the Codex Tonalpohualli, which describes a failed ritual where 13 priests consumed pulque during a solar eclipse. Instead of glimpsing the future, they became trapped in a shared hallucination of the past. Witnesses saw their bodies convulse as their shadows detached, crawling up the temple walls to reenact the sacrifice of the first sun god. By dawn, the priests had aged decades, their hair white, their fingers bent like old roots. When scribes asked what they'd seen, the eldest whispered, "We were the sacrifice." What makes these rituals especially chilling are the echoes that persist. In 2014, hikers in the Sierra Norte reported finding a circle of empty pulque gourds surrounding a single withered maguey plant, though the species hadn't grown there since the conquest. Nearby, their GPS devices malfunctioned, displaying dates centuries apart. Scientists blamed solar flares, but the Aztecs would have recognized the signs. Some loops never fully close, some drinks are meant to stay unfinished. In the dim, incense-heavy chambers of Aztec midwives, there existed a ritual so secret, even most priests only spoke of it in hushed tones: the smoke birth. When a child was stillborn or died moments after entering the world, these women performed a ceremony that defied the natural order. They believed a soul denied its first breath could be coaxed into trying again, not in another life, but in the same one, looped like thread through a needle's eye. The process began with wrapping the infant's body in cotton soaked in copal resin. Its sticky sweetness meant to trap the lingering tonalpohualli or life force. For 3 nights, the bundle would be suspended over a fire fueled by ocote wood, the smoke carrying whispered prayers to Citlalicu, the star-skirted goddess who wove souls into being. Midwives chanted as the smoke curled into spirals the same shape as the Aztec calendar, demanding time itself unwind far enough to let the child take that missed first breath. Archaeologists working near Tezcatlipoca unearthed evidence that shakes modern understanding. In a single grave, they found the skeleton of an infant buried with extraordinary care, but beneath it lay another tiny skeleton, arranged in an identical position. Both were wrapped in identical cotton shrouds, both surrounded by the same miniature clay toys. At first, it seemed a tragic case of siblings buried together. Then the tests came back. Carbon dating showed the skeletons were decades apart, yet their DNA matched. They were the same child. Further digs revealed more of these stacked graves, always with the same haunting details: toys placed in reverse order, as if unwrapping a gift, and jade beads tucked beneath the lower skeleton's tongue, a practice reserved for stopping souls from speaking of the underworld. Spanish friars documented frantic attempts to stamp out the ritual. In 1541, Fray Juan de Zumarraga described finding a midwife's hut filled with smoking bundles that mewled like kittens. When he slashed one open, he found not a body but a live infant coated in ash, its umbilical cord still pulsing as if freshly cut. The mother insisted this was her third time birthing the same baby, each iteration healthier than the last. The friar burned the hut, but not before noting the child's eyes, pupils slit like a cat's, a mark the Aztecs associated with souls that had stretched too thin between lives. What makes these findings even more unsettling are the accounts of survivors. In the 1970s, an anthropologist recording oral histories in Puebla met an elderly woman who claimed to remember her own smoke birth. She described floating in darkness, then being pulled backward like a fish on a line, only to wake gasping in her mother's arms years later. Medical exams revealed scars matching those of her stillborn brother, whose grave, when excavated, contained a tiny jade bead beneath the soil, right where her own navel would have been. The Aztecs saw time as a loom, its threads endlessly reusable. To them, a stillborn child wasn't a life cut short, but a tapestry with its first knot tied wrong. The smoke birth wasn't resurrection, it was reweaving, yet the cost was steep. Codices warn of infants returning incomplete, their fingernails never growing, their laughter silent. Some villages kept echo children apart, fearing they'd remember too much of the other side. One glyph depicts a toddler pointing at the moon, whispering the names of stars that wouldn't be discovered for centuries. Whether miracle or abomination, the smoke birth forces us to ask, if time is truly a circle, how many of us are walking it for the second time or the third without ever knowing? The siege of Tenochtitlan was more than a military defeat. It may have been the catastrophic collapse of a ritual meant to rewrite history itself. As Cortés and his forces tightened their grip on the island city in 1521, Moctezuma's priests weren't just preparing for battle. Beneath the chaos, they were scrambling to perform a ritual so audacious it bordered on heresy, a full-scale temporal reset of the entire capital. Survivor accounts describe frantic priests hauling ancient codices to the Templo Mayor, their pages fluttering with calculations to pinpoint the exact celestial alignment matching the city's founding in 1325. The plan, to recreate that moment of creation under siege conditions, tricking time into looping backward to a point before the Spanish ever set foot on their shores. The omens had been screaming at them for years. The Florentine Codex recounts how, a decade before Cortés arrived, a weeping statue of the goddess Xiuhpohualli was seen wandering the streets at night, her stone face slick with phantom tears. Fishermen pulled in nets full of blood-red water without a single fish. Most chilling of all was the mirror vision of Moctezuma himself. When his seers gazed into Tezcatlipoca's obsidian mirror, they didn't see the future. They saw the past, the same pyramids, the same canals, but populated by shadows wearing Spanish helmets, speaking broken Nahuatl. To the Aztecs, this wasn't prophecy. It was contamination, a sign that timelines were already fraying. When the siege began, the priest's ritual took on a desperate precision. Spanish chronicler Bernal Diaz del Castillo wrote of hearing eerie, syncopated drumming from the temples, not the usual war rhythms, but a staggered pattern mimicking the binding of years ceremony. On the night of the final assault, witnesses reported seeing priests atop the Templo Mayor holding what looked like ropes of smoke, their ends tied to the wrists of sacrificed captives arranged in a perfect spiral. Each corpse's chest was inscribed with a date from the founding era, their blood funneled into grooves that traced the city's original boundaries. The intention was clear: stitch present-day Tenochtitlan back to its moment of birth like pulling a drawstring shut. But something went terribly wrong. Diaz described a sound like the sky tearing as the Spanish breached the walls, followed by an unnatural silence. For 3 heartbeats, the battle froze. Conquistadors swore they glimpsed the city intact again, its pyramids gleaming, its canals unbroken, before reality snapped back with a force that knocked men to their knees. The Aztecs called this moment the god's hiccup, when time choked on its own loop. Archaeology hints at why the ritual failed. Excavations under modern Mexico City revealed a layer of artifacts from the siege Spanish muskets, Aztec obsidian blades, all coated in a strange blue dust later identified as powdered jade mixed with human bone ash. This wasn't ordinary ritual debris. Jade symbolized eternity, and bone ash anchored souls to the physical world. Together, they formed a temporal mortar meant to bind the reset in place. But the mixture was flawed. Testing shows the ash came from victims of smallpox, a disease the Aztecs had never encountered before. Their souls carried no memory of the city's founding era, creating cracks in the ritual's symmetry. The aftermath was a paradox etched in blood. Spanish accounts contradict themselves wildly. Cortés is described entering Moctezuma's palace on 3 different dates in their own records. Aztec survivors insisted they fought the same battles twice, recognizing individual conquistadors they'd already killed. Even the landscape bore scars. Early colonial maps show streets that curve back on themselves in impossible loops, and the Templo Mayor's ruins were found with sections of stairs counting downward instead of up, as if the pyramid had momentarily inverted its own history. Was it mass hysteria or evidence of a timeline that almost reset? The Aztecs themselves seemed divided. Some glyphs carved after the conquest depict the siege as a branching path, one road leading to ruin, the other to a Tenochtitlan untouched by Spanish steel. But the most haunting clue lies in Moctezuma's fate. According to both Aztec and Spanish sources, in his final hours, the emperor began speaking in a dialect no one recognized, using words that wouldn't exist for another 100 years. Perhaps he didn't just foresee the future. Perhaps for a flickering moment he was already living in the loop's other side. After the fall of Tenochtitlan, Spanish friars systematically burned thousands of Aztec manuscripts in their zeal to erase pagan beliefs, but a handful of codices survived, their scorched edges and suspiciously blank pages whispering of forbidden knowledge. Among these fragmented texts, one phrase appears again and again in marginal notes or hastily scraped away sections. Ehecatl, roughly translated as to repeat the unrepeatable. The Florentine Codex, compiled by Bernardino de Sahagún with the help of surviving Aztec scribes, contains the most glaring omissions. Entire passages about priestly rituals end mid-sentence, their conclusions replaced by Christian moralizing. But look closer and patterns emerge. In Book 6, a description of new fire ceremonies suddenly veers into nonsense, the Nahuatl glyphs twisting into spirals before the page dissolves into ink blots. Scholars now believe these aren't damage marks, they're deliberate censorship, hiding instructions for temporal manipulation. The Codex Borgia offers even darker clues. On a seemingly innocuous page depicting the god Quetzalcoatl creating the calendar, infrared imaging reveals a painted overlayer showing the same god tearing a hole in a celestial band, his fingers gripping what appears to be a wrinkle in the fabric of the sky. Nearby, numbers repeat in impossible sequences, 2 sets of 52-year cycles overlapping, then merging. Most chilling is a half-burned page where a priest's speech scroll curls back on itself like an Ouroboros, the words "the day will come again" visible beneath the char. Then there's the Codex Magliobrchiano, its colorful depictions of gods interrupted by bizarre anomalies. One illustration of Tlaloc shows the rain god's headdress feathers pointing in opposite directions, a visual representation of time splitting. Another page depicts a sacrificed warrior twice in the same scene, his body in 2 positions simultaneously mid-fall. Spanish annotations dismiss these as artist errors, but the original Nahuatl caption beneath, only partially erased, reads, "He who falls once and falls again." Perhaps the most damning evidence comes from the Orban Codex, a post-conquest history secretly maintained by Aztec scribes. In its account of Moctezuma's reign, a passage describes priests performing a ceremony during the days of no time, likely the Nemontemi, where the sun stood still as a stone. The next page is missing, torn out with such violence that the stitching remains frayed centuries later. The surviving text jumps abruptly to Moctezuma's death, but the chronology is impossibly scrambled, Spanish accounts placed outside their own historical order, as if someone tried to reweave the timeline and failed. These fragments suggest a terrifying possibility that the Aztecs didn't just believe in cyclical time, they left instructions for bending it. The burned pages may not have been destroyed to hide pagan idolatry, but because they contained recipes for rituals too dangerous even for the Inquisition to comprehend. When Sahagun wrote of Aztec priests who made their years double back like a wounded snake, was he recording a superstition or a warning? Even today, in the mist-shrouded villages of rural Mexico, whispers persist about the Nahuel's shapeshifters who walk between worlds, wearing the skins of animals and the shadows of the past. These aren't just folk tales to scare children, they're eerie echoes of the Aztecs' most forbidden time rituals. Old men in Oaxaca recount stumbling upon jaguars with human eyes, only to find their grandfathers sitting by the fire later, humming songs no one's heard for generations. Women in Puebla speak of waking to the scent of copal incense, their kitchens filled with the laughter of long-dead aunts, the tamales on the table still steaming though no one had cooked them. These stories share a spine-chilling detail. Time doesn't just bend for the Nahuels, it loops. A farmer in Veracruz once swore he lived the same Tuesday 3 times in a row. Each morning, the same rooster crowed at the exact same broken pitch. The same stranger in a black poncho asked for directions to a town that didn't exist, and the same scorpion stung his left thumb at sunset. On the third repetition, he claims he glimpsed his own silhouette walking ahead of him, flickering like a candle flame. When he shouted, the figure turned, revealing not his face, but his great-grandfather's before vanishing into the dusk. Local healers nodded knowingly. They called it Tezcatlipoca, the eating of time, and blamed it on a Nahuel passing too close to the living. The connection to ancient rituals is undeniable. Aztec priests believed Nahuels were guardians of temporal gateways, capable of slipping into alternate moments like thieves through a window. Modern anthropologists have recorded accounts in Michoacan where entire villages insist they've collectively lost a day, waking to find their calendars a step behind the rest of the world, their livestock already fed by unseen hands. One particularly chilling case from the 1970s involved a schoolhouse in Hidalgo where children drew the same picture of a pyramid for a week, unaware they were replicating their own artwork anew each morning. The teacher, an elderly woman versed in old traditions, burned occult resin in the corners until the loop broke. The Nahuel was bored, she later told researchers. It wanted to play, but why would these time walkers linger? Some say they're trapped priests from botched rituals, their souls split between eras. Others claim their ancestors testing the living, ensuring traditions aren't forgotten. The most unsettling theory comes from a shaman in Guerrero, who insists Nahuels aren't individuals at all, but glitches in the Aztec calendar itself, places where the Tonalpohualli's gears jammed, leaving frayed edges that snag the present. He points to recent discoveries of pre-Hispanic artifacts embedded in modern construction sites, their carvings showing events that haven't happened yet. Time isn't straight here, he murmurs. It's a spiral with broken steps. Next time you're in Mexico and a street vendor's radio suddenly crackles with static, playing a song from your childhood at the exact moment you remember it, or you catch a whiff of your grandmother's perfume in an empty alley, don't dismiss it as déjà vu. The Aztecs warned that some threads of the past never fully unravel. They simply wait for the right moment or the right Nahuel to pull them taut again. Buried beneath layers of volcanic ash and centuries of skepticism, the so-called calendar disc remains one of Mesoamerican archaeology's most hotly contested artifacts. Discovered in a sealed chamber near Teotihuacan in 1989, this 5-foot-wide slab of basalt is carved with a spiral of glyphs that defy conventional interpretation. At first glance, it resembles the standard Aztec solar calendar, but look closer and the anomalies emerge. The day signs aren't arranged in their traditional sequence. Instead, they loop back on themselves in tangled knots, with certain dates repeating like a scratched record. Most unsettling are the corner carvings showing figures mid-motion, a priest raising a knife, a captive collapsing but mirrored in reverse, as if depicting the same moment from opposing directions in time. Mainstream scholars dismiss it as a ritual object or an artistic outlier, but independent researchers point to chilling details. The disc was found face down atop a bed of crushed jade and magnetite materials the Aztecs associated with temporal manipulation. Even more telling, the chamber's walls were lined with sheets of mica, a mineral known to distort reflections. Was this a workbench for priests experimenting with time loops, or merely a symbolic representation of cyclical mythology? The debate rages, but the academic establishment avoids one glaring possibility, that the disc wasn't just a metaphor but a manual. The resistance isn't just about evidence, it's about paradigm shifts. Admitting that the Aztecs might have dabbled in temporal engineering would upend our understanding of ancient technology. It's easier to label such finds as ceremonial than to confront the discomforting idea that a civilization without electricity grasped concepts modern physics is still unraveling. Yet whispers persist among field archaeologists. During the Templo Mayor excavations in 2012, workers uncovered a subchamber filled with identical obsidian blades arranged in concentric circles, each blade microscopically thinner than the last, as if someone had been testing how finely time could be sliced before it fractured. The official report called it a storage anomaly. The dig crew called it something else, a workshop. And then there are the gaps, literal voids in the archaeological record that hint at undiscovered spaces. Ground-penetrating radar scans near the Great Pyramid of Collula reveal labyrinthine tunnels branching outward, but many lead to hollow chambers never entered since their sealing. One such void, detected in 2018, echoes with a metallic resonance when mapped, its dimensions matching descriptions of the legendary Tile Shaloni, or seeing rooms, where priests allegedly communed with fractured timeline. The Mexican government has halted further exploration, citing structural risks, but insiders murmur about artifacts too unsettling to disclose. Perhaps the truth lies in what hasn't been found. No civilization obsessed with recording every ritual, every battle, every celestial event would leave zero evidence of their most dangerous experiments unless that evidence was deliberately hidden. Or worse, unless those experiments worked, folding certain knowledge back into the shadows of time. The calendar disc now sits in a museum basement labeled Storage Pending Study. Every 6 months, a staff member reports hearing faint chanting from its crate, always on the same date inscribed at the disc's center. Coincidence or a loop no one's figured out how to close. The Aztecs didn't just fear time, they fought it. Their rituals reveal a civilization that saw existence as a wheel, spinning through cycles of creation and destruction, where the past wasn't just memory but a living force that could be reshaped. Imagine the sheer audacity of priests who didn't merely predict eclipses but used them as doorways, who didn't just honor their gods but dared to bargain with the fabric of reality itself. These weren't superstitions, they were experiments in bending time to human will, conducted with the precision of astronomers and the desperation of a people who believed the cosmos demanded payment in blood. Yet every ritual came with a warning etched in bone and ash. The priests who vanished mid-ceremony, the warriors trapped in nightmares that repeated like a broken drumbeat, the cities erased from history as if the gods themselves had grown weary of their ambition. The Aztecs understood something we've forgotten. Time isn't a passive river we float down. It's a current that fights back when you try to swim upstream. Their greatest fear wasn't the end of the world. It was getting stuck in a loop, doomed to relive the same moment forever like a moth battering itself against a flame. This obsession with cyclical time forces us to question our own linear view of history. We see progress as an arrow, but the Aztecs saw it as a spiral, where every revolution brings us face to face with echoes of the past. Modern physicists toy with similar ideas: wormholes, parallel universes, quantum entanglement, yet we dismiss the Aztecs as primitive. But what if they glimpsed truths we're only now beginning to unravel? The eerie parallels between their rituals and today's theories of time dilation or causal loops suggest they weren't just myth makers. They were pioneers in a science we've yet to fully comprehend. So here's the question that lingers like smoke from a censer. Would you dare, if you knew the ritual, if you had the chance to loop back and undo one mistake, one loss, one moment that haunts you, would you risk it? The Aztecs warned that every loop leaves a mark, that time demands interest on its borrowed moments. Their stories whisper of warriors who rewound their deaths only to forget their own names, of lovers who relived their first kiss until it curdled into a grotesque parody. But still they tried, because perhaps the greater horror isn't the risk of breaking time, it's the thought of living with a past you can never change. The next time you feel déjà vu, or catch a scent that catapults you years backward, or dream of a moment so vivid it lingers at dawn, remember the Aztecs. Their mirrors may lie shattered, their temples buried under modern streets, but their legacy lingers in those fleeting cracks where time still feels thin. They challenged the unchangeable, and whether they succeeded or failed, they left us with this: the unsettling idea that the past isn't as fixed as it seems. And that maybe, just maybe, some doors should stay closed.